In August 1998, residents of a small town in Ohio woke up to news that shook the entire country. A father had shot and killed his two sons right in their own home. It was a shock to neighbors. Just the day before, they had seen the family as ordinary, quiet, and unremarkable. But behind closed doors, tension had been building for years, which suddenly erupted into a brutal crime. The Mason family lived on the outskirts of a small town in Ohio. Their house was not much different from others. A neat facade, a well-kept lawn, a few bushes at the entrance. On the surface, everything looked fine. But within this family, a conflict had been developing for years, which neighbors only guessed at, but could never imagine its scale. His father, George Mason, was born in 1958. He grew up in a strict working-class family where discipline and physical labor were considered the main virtues of a man. He worked from a young age and later got a job at a factory where he remained for the rest of his life. Colleagues described him as a withdrawn and demanding person who rarely entered into close relationships with others. George's wife, Margaret, was his complete opposite, quiet, unnoticeable. She devoted all her time to her home and children. Outwardly, this couple looked stable, but in reality, family responsibilities were divided in such a way that the husband made all the decisions and the wife only followed him. The family had two sons, Thomas and Richard. Thomas was born in 1979, Richard in 1981. From an early age, they differed from their father's idea of real boys. Both preferred books and music to physical labor. At school, they participated in art and literature clubs. For George, this was a disappointment. He expected his sons to follow his path, choose a factory, a craft, or the army. Over the years, the differences became more and more obvious. Thomas went to college to study sociology, and Richard chose journalism. Their interests and social circles further distanced them from their father. They socialized with people from creative communities, participated in discussions and student actions. George considered all this a waste of time and called it not a man's business. The turning point came when both sons came out to their parents as homosexuals. This was a bold step in a small American town in the late 1990s. But for the Mason family, it was the beginning of an open war. George took this revelation as a personal blow and shame. His reaction was aggressive, loud quarrels, threats, insults. Margaret did not interfere. She was afraid of her husband's outbursts and tried to smooth over conflicts with silence. Neighbors later recalled seeing her depressed and tired, but no one knew the details. By the mid-1990s, the Masons' home was no longer a quiet place. Arguments became regular. The police were called several times by neighbors who heard screaming and swearing at night, but no one filed official reports. Everything remained inside the house. Financial dependence kept the sons in their parents' home. Despite their studies, they could not afford to live separately. This only increased the tension. Father and sons were forced to be under the same roof every day, and each day the relationship became worse. In the summer of 1998, the situation reached its limit. The accumulated hatred and intransigence became the impetus for a tragedy that would soon shake the entire country. The August day of 1998 began like many others in the Mason household. George returned from the factory for lunch, his shift ending early. He seemed irritated, barely spoke to his wife, and soon locked himself in the garage. Neighbors said they heard the sound of metal banging, where he often spent time, tidying up tools or cleaning the guns he kept in the house. George owned several guns, a shotgun for hunting, and two pistols, one of which he had purchased legally several years before the events. Thomas and Richard arrived home late that afternoon. The elder, Thomas, arrived by car after working part-time at the student center. Richard arrived later with a backpack and a stack of notes. He was preparing for a university project. Both were calm, but it was clear that they tried to keep their interactions with their father to a minimum. Margaret was preparing dinner, and at some point the whole family found themselves at the same table. That's when the argument that would be the last began. According to the official investigation materials, it all started with a routine conversation about plans for the future. Thomas mentioned that he was going to go to Cleveland with friends for the weekend. George reacted sharply. In his opinion, his son spent too much time on his company and thought too little about work and serious life. Richard intervened in the argument, taking his brother's side. What happened next was fast-paced. George began shouting, accusing his sons of bringing shame to the family. His words again included insults about their sexual orientation. The sons responded openly and harshly. declaring that they no longer intended to hide their relationship. The atmosphere at the table became extremely tense. Margaret witnessed the incident. According to her, she tried to steer the conversation away, but George was already in a state of great irritation. He got up from the table, headed to the garage, and returned a few minutes later with a gun in his hands. The events that followed were reconstructed later based on Margaret's testimony and the results of the examination. George entered the living room where his sons were and demanded that they stop torturing him and live a normal life. The sons did not respond. Thomas, according to his mother, tried to get up and leave, but at that very moment, George raised his weapon. The first shot was fired at about 8:15 p.m. The bullet hit Thomas in the chest. He fell near the couch. Richard screamed and ran to his brother, but a second shot followed. Both bullets were fired from close range. Margaret screamed at this point and tried to stop her husband, but he pushed her away. In a state of shock, she ran outside to her neighbors. It was her screams that caused the first witnesses to call 911. Police arrived a few minutes later. When they entered the house, George was sitting in a chair with a gun in his lap. According to officers, he offered no resistance and appeared subdued but calm. He was immediately detained. The bodies of both sons were found at the crime scene. Medical workers confirmed the death of Thomas and Richard before they arrived at the hospital. Later, experts confirmed that the weapon was in good working order and that the shooting was deliberate. No signs of a struggle were found in the house. Everything indicated that this was a deliberate act, not an accident. Margaret, who gave her first testimony immediately after her husband's arrest, was in a state of severe shock. There was no attempt to justify George in her words. She only repeated that she did not believe in what was happening and until the very end, hoped that it was only a threat. Police reports from that evening record George admitting to shooting his sons. His words were cold and direct. "They didn't listen to me. I did what I had to do." That testimony would later prove crucial at trial. For the local community, the incident was an event that was difficult to comprehend. Neighbors who had known the family for more than a decade said they had never seen George so aggressive. Many recalled hearing arguments, but no one expected such a violent outcome. That evening, the Masons' home was surrounded by police cars, reporters, and onlookers. The street, usually quiet and empty, became a place where the shocking crime was discussed. After George Mason was arrested, police officers took him to the local station. In the first hours after his arrest, he was calm, almost indifferent. According to officers, he did not try to justify himself, did not ask questions, and did not ask for a lawyer. His state was described as detached. When asked about the reason for the crime, George uttered a short phrase, "I couldn't take it anymore." The investigation began immediately. Forensic experts arrived at the scene and recorded all the details: the gun with George's fingerprints, traces of blood in the living room, the bodies of the sons lying next to each other. The situation in the house looked almost normal, except for the chaos caused by the tragedy. There were plates with uneaten dinner on the table, dishes in the sink, the TV was on. This picture further emphasized the cruelty and suddenness of what happened. Margaret, the only witness to the crime, was in a state of severe shock. At first, she gave confused testimony, but after a few days, she was able to describe the events of the evening in detail. She confirmed that the quarrel began at dinner and that George went to the garage to get a gun, returning with the intention of attacking his sons. Neighbors interviewed that night reported hearing screams and gunshots. Several people saw Margaret run from the house, screaming for help. It was their 911 calls that were critical to the police's quick response. The investigation found that George had not planned the murder in advance. No notes or direct evidence of preparation were found on him. However, experts noted that the storage of the weapon in an easily accessible place, as well as the words about the need to restore order, indicated a conscious decision made at the time of the quarrel. During interrogations, George answered in monosyllables. He was not interested in what would happen to him next. When the investigator asked him if he understood that he had killed his own sons, he calmly replied, "They were no longer my sons." These words were later repeatedly quoted in the press and discussed as a reflection of his attitude to the situation. Psychiatrists who were involved in the investigation had to determine whether George was in a state of affect or mental disorder. Their conclusion was unambiguous. He was completely sane, aware of his actions, and able to control them. Particular attention was paid to the motive. During the investigation, it became clear that George had been in conflict with his sons for many years because of their orientation. Several witnesses from Thomas and Richard's circle confirmed that their father openly insulted them forbade them to bring friends over, and threatened to evict them from the house. Despite this, the brothers continued to live with their parents for financial reasons. Margaret gave evidence that in recent years, the relationship within the family had become unbearable. She described her husband as a man who was increasingly irritable, silent for long periods of time, and then would flare up at the slightest provocation. However, she admitted that she never believed that it would come to violence. Another important episode also emerged during the investigation. Several weeks before the tragedy, George had complained to a colleague about his sons. He said that he wouldn't be able to stand it if they continued to behave like this. The colleague did not attach any importance to these words, considering them an emotional reaction. The evidence collected was more than enough for the prosecutor's office. There was direct testimony from the wife, testimony from neighbors, a confession from the accused himself, and expert examination results. The evidence clearly indicated that the murder was committed intentionally, with no signs of self-defense or accident. While George was in jail, the town was preparing for the trial. Local newspapers published news stories daily, discussing the details of the case. Many residents expressed sympathy for Margaret, who was left alone, having lost 2 sons and a husband at once, albeit for a different reason. The press actively discussed the topic of homophobia and how it can lead to domestic violence. This case became resonant precisely because patricide of children due to their orientation remained rare in the 1990s, but at the same time reflected real social conflicts in American society. The investigation was completed within a few months. The prosecutor's office charged George with 2 counts of premeditated murder. The trial was scheduled for the spring of next year. By this point, George still showed no remorse. In an interview he agreed to give to a local reporter through his lawyer, he said, "I did what I thought was right." Those words sealed the public's view of him as a man who acted not out of emotion, but out of deep-seated conviction. The George Mason trial began in the spring of 1999 and immediately attracted the attention of not only local residents, but also national media. At that time, the issues of sexual minority rights were actively discussed in the United States, and the case in which a father killed his 2 sons because of their orientation became especially resonant. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, human rights activists, and ordinary citizens were present. For Margaret, the trial was a difficult test. She had lost both her children and now had to face her husband again, who was sitting in the dock. The prosecution built its case clearly and consistently. The evidence presented included Margaret's testimony about the events of the evening, George's confession immediately after his arrest, expert opinion that he was sane and acted consciously, testimonies of neighbors who heard shots and screams, data on long-term conflicts in the family. Particular emphasis was placed on the motive for the crime. The prosecutor stressed that the murder was the result of long-term hatred and rejection of his sons. This, he said, was not a sudden impulse, but a conscious decision to exclude from the family what the defendant considered a disgrace. The defense tried to build a line on the fact that George acted in a state of intense emotional stress caused by long-term conflicts. His lawyer insisted that this was a crime of passion, not a premeditated murder. To this end, witnesses were called who spoke of drastic changes in his behavior in recent years. However, psychiatric experts insisted that his emotional outbursts did not deprive him of the ability to understand the consequences. The court took into account that George took the gun from the garage and returned to the house with the intention of shooting. The defendant's own behavior in the courtroom was controversial. He showed little emotion, sat quietly, did not look at Margaret, and avoided eye contact with the audience. Only once, when the prosecutor read his confession, did George say briefly, "I told the truth." The closing arguments left the public with little doubt. The prosecutor asked for the maximum sentence, life imprisonment without parole. The defense attorney asked for the defendant's age and emotional pressure to be taken into account, but his arguments looked weak against the evidence. The verdict was announced in April 1999. George Mason was found guilty of 2 counts of premeditated murder. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Margaret, this day became the final turning point. She was left alone, having lost not only her children, but also her husband, who spent the rest of his life in prison. The public perceived the verdict as fair, but the trial itself became the occasion for a wider debate in the media about family conflicts related to sexual orientation and how intolerance can lead to tragic consequences. After the verdict was announced, the Mason family's life was finally divided into before and after. The house where the tragedy occurred soon became empty. Margaret could not stay there. Every detail reminded her of what had happened. At first, she lived with relatives, then moved to another city. According to acquaintances, she tried to avoid publicity and did not give interviews to journalists. Although she received offers on numerous occasions, George's fate was sealed. He was transferred to a maximum security prison where he served a life sentence. According to prison reports, he behaved calmly and had no conflicts with other prisoners. Official documents indicated that he received almost no letters and had no contact with the outside world. The only person who visited him several times in the first years of his imprisonment was Margaret, but after 2002, the meetings ceased completely. For the local community, the Masons' case was a stark reminder of how destructive family conflicts based on rejection and prejudice can be. The details of the trial were widely discussed on the streets. Schools and universities held lectures on tolerance, citing the case as an example of what hatred within a family can lead to. The media continued to return to the topic for several years. National newspapers published stories about the crime, focusing on the fact that it was motivated by homophobia. Journalists viewed it as part of a wider problem of domestic violence, where children are faced with rejection of their sexuality. At the federal level, the Mason case did not directly impact legislation, but it became one of the stories cited by advocates when discussing the need for programs to support teens and young adults who experience discrimination in their families. Margaret lived a reclusive life in the years that followed. She avoided mentioning her husband and rarely spoke publicly about her sons. She is known to have attended several memorial events for victims of domestic violence, but she always remained in the shadows. The Mason home in suburban Ohio never regained its former appearance. After George's arrest and Margaret's departure, it was put up for sale, but no one took a long time to find a buyer. For neighbors, the house became a grim reminder of the tragedy. Only a few years later, new owners bought it, completely rebuilding the interior. The Masons' case entered the crime news of the late 1990s as one of the most resonant in the region. It showed how deeply personal beliefs and intolerance can destroy a family and lead to tragic consequences. The story of the Mason family is not just the tragedy of a single house in suburban Ohio. It is an example of how internal intransigence, accumulated grievances, and prejudices can destroy the lives of several people at once. Behind the external facade of an ordinary family, there were constant conflicts that no one tried to resolve for years. The investigation and trial showed that the murder was not an accident or a sudden outburst of rage. It was the result of years of suppressed aggression and intolerance. George Mason failed to accept his sons as they were, and his hardened stance gradually turned into hatred. Ultimately, this led to a crime that took the lives of two young men and forever changed the fate of their mother. The public outcry around the case showed that such tragedies are not isolated cases, but part of a larger social problem. In the late 1990s, American society was already beginning to openly discuss issues of equality and the rights of sexual minorities. But cases of domestic violence on this basis remained a taboo topic. The Masons' story became one of the reasons to talk about how rejection in the family can be no less destructive than external pressure. For the town where the murder took place, the case became a lesson. Neighbors who had long considered the family closed but outwardly normal understood that hidden conflicts can accumulate and remain unnoticed until the moment of tragedy. For the general public, it became an example of how homophobia and cruel parental pressure can lead to fatal consequences. Margaret, who lost her children and husband, remains a symbol of a side of the story that is little talked about. The victims are not only those who die, but also those who are forced to live with the memories of what happened. Today, the Masons' case remains in the archives as one of the key cases of the late 20th century in Ohio. It serves as a reminder that intolerance within a family is not a private matter, but a threat that can escalate into public tragedy.